Hello, everyone. For those of you who are new to Beck, at least one of you is new. We meet every noon from noon to 12 to 1:30. And then if it's an in-person Beck, then we often go to coffee with the speaker. And so we have an hour of lecture followed by 30 minutes or more of Q&A. And we keep introductions really short so that our speakers get time to present their work. I do want to say that the next two Beck talks are going to be in person. So our own Renee Hagen is going to talk next week here, modeling the dynamics of social norms. And so if people want to go to dinner with Renee, please let me know. And then the following week, we have an out-of-town speaker coming in person. This is Nicole Thompson-Gonzalez speaking about social paths to health and fitness in primates. And following that, we will have two more MPI speakers. Caroline Shipley talking about skill acquisition and life history towards a better understanding of cognitive evolution, and Laurel Fogarty on our last session, cultural rescue, avoiding extinction with gene culture coevolution. And today we're really happy to have John Bunce and Caissa Revilla Minaya co-presenting their work. So they work together in the Amazon, and their talk is called Cultural Dynamics in an Indigenous Amazonian Population, an exploration of intra and interethnic causal mechanisms. So please join me in welcoming them to virtual Beck.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Susan, and thanks for inviting us to.
We're so happy you're here. Thank you. I miss MPI.
Yep.
One question: can you see our PowerPoint presentation? Is it maximized or not really?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay.
Seeing you in the upper right-hand corner. If you have any parts of your presentation that are very important in the very upper right-hand corner, then that might be a problem. Just move your little box. But yeah, it looks like it's working well.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, so like I said, thanks for inviting us. And today we'd like to show you some of our recent work on cultural dynamics or cultural change in an Amazonian population. And this is part of ongoing research in the Culture, Environment, and Health Research Group that Caissa and I lead together at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. So with our postdoc, Dr. Catalina Fernandez, let's see if I can get a pointer. There she is. Dr. Catalina Fernandez here on the right. We focus on how the dynamics of cultural norms, perceptions of the environment, and subsistence practices impact health and the concept of well-being, and particularly in societies with low-intensity integration into the global market economy. So we take complementary approaches to these research questions. Caissa brings her training as a sociocultural and environmental anthropologist. Catalina brings her expertise in the biological anthropology of health. And I work in evolutionary anthropology and cultural dynamics. So we're going to talk today about cultural dynamics in a particular indigenous population, but we want to emphasize that the mechanisms we explore here link to much broader patterns in human cultural evolution. So humans exhibit an extraordinary degree of behavioral flexibility compared to other animals, and it's precisely this behavioral flexibility that's allowed us to survive and raise children in nearly all of Earth's terrestrial ecosystems. The flexibility is the product of features of human cognition that make us really good at both individual and social learning, even compared to other intelligent animals like dolphins and the apes and cebus. However, there are other consequences of the fact that most human behavior is learned. One of which is that the behavioral variation of our species is not homogeneously distributed. Rather, it exhibits quite a bit of group structure. So for instance, the Inuit of northern Canada have to learn how to make clothes out of seal skin. And they dress very differently from the way another group of people, the Machiengo of the Peruvian Amazon, these happen to be the people we work with, very different from how the Machiengo learn how to dress. And they use woven cotton, for instance. And the differences in dress are obviously not genetically encoded. They're the result of learning from others around you, and in some cases from experimenting on your own. And in this sense, learning is a driver of behavioral differences between groups. Now, we often call such groups ethnic groups, and the different suites of behaviors and beliefs that distinguish them, we often refer to as cultures. Now, we're interested in how and why such behavioral traits change over time. both as a result of mechanisms internal to the ethnic group and as a result of intergroup contact and engagement. So for instance, the ancestors of all Amazonian peoples, including the Machianga, probably migrated from Asia around 20,000 years ago. And the migration route took them through some cold climates, and we can imagine these ancestors probably dressed in a style broadly similar to that of the Inuit. However, as humans migrated south into Amazonia, into warmer climates, they had to learn to dress in a very different way. And they invented these new styles of dress by themselves, because obviously at the time there weren't any other humans in Amazonia to learn from. So we can think of this as behavioral change resulting from mechanisms internal to a group of people. However, Machianga styles of dress, like most other cultural beliefs and behaviors, are not static. So rather than woven cotton tunics that were popular generations ago, most Machianga these days wear Western manufactured clothes. You can see that examples here. Now, the reason for this change in clothing style is related, at least in part, to their increasing engagement over the years with mestizo colonists here. And they were the ones who first introduced manufactured clothes to the Machianga. So we can think of this as behavioral change influenced, at least partly, by intergroup interactions.
What we want to show you today is some of our work exploring both the internal mechanisms and the external influences on cultural dynamics. As you'll see, this work relies heavily on both qualitative and quantitative field methods. I'll start by showing you some of my data on the complex system of Machianga dietary and behavioral restrictions or taboos, and how these inspire a theory for the internal mechanisms by which such restrictions arise and change. Then John will talk about how interethnic interactions with mestizos are driving changes in other Machianga cultural norms. So this is the structure of the talk today. First, I'll talk about what drives diversity and dynamics of the dietary restrictions. And then John will show you how interethnic engagements drives norm dynamics. So the work that I'm going to present is based on fieldwork carried out in the Machianga native community of Tayacome, here the blue dots in the map, which is located inside the Manu National Park, shown here in gray, in the southeastern Amazonian region of Peru. The community consists of about 200 Machianga people and was established on the Manu River during the early 1960s by Protestant missionaries who were expelled after the creation of the park by the Peruvian government in 1973. The administration of the park, of the Manu National Park, permitted the Machianga to stay within the limits of the park under the condition that they continue using what the park considered their traditional subsistence activities, which include horticulture, hunting, fishing, and gathering of wild resources, which are activities that they currently practice. For this reason, there is continuing tension between the park administration and the Machianga that involve, well, not only issues of self-determination, but also conflicting Western and non-Western conceptions of the environment and how, what is the role of humans in it, which is a focus of my work. I'm interested in the interactions that people have with their environment, in particular in exploring whether the conceptions they have of animals and plants affect their environmental behavior. One of the contexts of interaction where I could observe this happening was through the observance of food and behavioral restrictions against particular species. So we know that food restrictions, which are the strong moral prohibitions against consuming something in general or in particular circumstances or contexts, are practiced worldwide and are often important identity markers and indicators of how people order and conceptualize their words. These restrictions also involve notions of the role of humans and the relations that they maintain with the surrounding environment. There are a number of theories to explain the emergence of food taboos, ranging from symbolic interpretations of non-human beings that people consume as food, to functionalist explanations of the utility of avoiding food during particular stages of people's lives. And I here will mention two examples. Viveros de Castro proposed that Amerindian peoples are perspectivists, meaning that they attribute a human soul to non-human beings, and therefore that these beings have a human perspective of the world. He suggests that people practice food restrictions against these ontologically similar species in order to avoid a type of metaphysical cannibalism. Baer proposed a similar explanation for the taboos practiced among the Machiguenga of the Urubamba region of Peru, which is different from we work, suggesting that they do not eat predatory species because these are hunters, and therefore they are similar to the Machiguenga. So eating them would also be considered cannibalism. Henrich and Henrich, for their part, propose an evolutionary explanation for adaptive and maladaptive taboos in Fijian communities. According to them, mildly poisonous fish that are normally eaten are taboos for pregnant and lactating mothers in order to protect the more susceptible fetuses and infants from the toxins in these species. In my work among the Machiguenga, while investigating their perceptions of non-human beings and of their environment in general, I have observed that food and behavioral taboos are indeed an important context of interaction with such entities. However, the reasons why certain animals and plants are avoided seem to differ from the explanations provided by the theories I mentioned previously. So with this in mind, I decided to take a closer look at why certain species are considered taboo by the Machiguenga of this community of Tayacome, and whether theories previously proposed were potential explanations for the emergence of these restrictions. In order to explore the emergence of food and behavioral restrictions against certain non-human beings in Tayacome, I used a mixed methods approach, employing complementary qualitative ethnography and quantitative data collection. During the more than 21 months that I spent in Tayacome, I heard stories widely known in the community about animals that at the beginning of time used to be Machiguenga people. In a number of cases, the narratives recount fable-like anecdotes about different animals who experience life in a human-like fashion. Other stories describe how the Machiguenga, like god Tazorinsi, created the world and then converted some of the recently created Machiguenga into animals, especially game animals. However, during my time in the community, I heard diverse opinions regarding the current ontological status of these entities. So it was not clear whether everyone believed that their humanity was reified by the presence of a soul or a human soul that is called Osire or Isire in Machiguenga. Different people spoke of certain species as if they were more powerful than common humans and more similar to the powerful Machiguenga healer that is called Seripigari, Machiguenga. However, other species were less powerful and were only dangerous to consume by sick or weak people. For the majority of Machiguenga, the soul of a non-human being seems to refer to its capacity to affect people, especially spiritually. It is a condition of power, either benign or evil, that some non-human beings have over the Machigenga. This is different from how the Machigenga think of their own soul, or the human soul. This notion of non-human souls seems to be key to some food and behavioral taboos established against certain animals and plants, which in my experience is one of the most important contexts of interaction between the Machigenga and non-human beings. This is especially true for those taboos practiced during the period of Kuvot, which is the set of behavioral rules that a couple follow while they have an infant. The Machigenga practice different taboos in other contexts as well. For instance, in order to maintain hunting abilities or those observed during rites of passage. But the taboos practiced during the Kuvot seem to be the most conspicuous in the community in Tayakome. According to this practice, parents of infants younger than approximately 2 years old should refrain from eating or interacting also with a variety of animals and plants. Otherwise, the spirit of their child can be stolen by these beings, and the child will get sick and die. I explored these conceptions in more detail by conducting a formal interview that consisted of inquiring which entities have souls and are considered taboos during the Kuvot. I created a list of 47 non-human beings, including both salient and non-salient animals and plants reported by the Machigenga in previous free lists. Then I asked 53 people, 53 adults in Tayakome, whether each of the elements of the list first have a soul or not, and why, and second, are harmful for infants if their parents consume or interact with them. Then I analyze people's answers to each of these questions using item response theory or IRT models in a Bayesian statistical framework. So the item response theory models allow us to simultaneously compare people's responses to a series of questions by mapping them into a small number of latent dimensions. We can observe how people in general and in combination categorize beings according to their locations on this latent axis. So in order to explore the relationship between Machigenga conceptions of non-human beings, souls, and or the capacity of these entities to harm infants, I analyzed people's responses using an IRT model with 2 dimensions, represented in this graphic by 2 axes, one for each of those characteristics. The horizontal axis here represents the characteristic of soul, with those non-human entities that most people attribute with a soul plotted towards the left of the axis, and those that most people consider soulless plotted to the right. Yeah. Similarly, the vertical axis represents the taboo characteristic. Those entities falling towards the lower part of the axis here were considered by most interviewees to be taboo, while those on the upper extreme of the axis were not taboo. So these are the results that I had after doing the IRT analysis. Each point is the posterior mean position of each non-human being on the taboo axis and on the soul axis. The results of this analysis suggest that in general, there is a positive correlation between these 2 features. However, as can we see by the spread points across the middle of the plot, for many species, there was no consensus among interviewed people, like especially these ones, about whether they have souls or are taboos. or whether there is a relationship between these features. So this suggests that other reasons, in addition to possessing a soul or being a former or current human, seem to be at play in the determination of taboos. So first we have those beings that possess a soul and are taboos, located in the lower left region of the graph. These are considered spiritually powerful and are capable of stealing the soul of an infant if their parents interact with them. They can be either evil or benevolent entities, such as the jaguar here that you can see that can physically and spiritually harm the Machigenga, or the armadillo, who is called in Machigenga Nosaro, or grandfather, that wanders around people's houses at night to check up on them and make sure that they are healthy. Other species are harmful because they possess physical characteristics that can damage infants, such as the large canines of the predatory fish called chambira here in the middle. For these kinds of beings, however, there is no consensus among the interviewed people about whether they possess a soul or any kind of intentionality to harm. That's why they are located in the middle of the soul axis. The only species that was considered harmful, but virtually all the people that I interviewed believe that it doesn't have a soul, is bamboo, that is located here in the lower right quadrant of the graph. People in Tayacome agree that this plant does not have any kind of animistic feature, but it is dangerous if men use it to make the tips of their arrows when their wives are pregnant, because it can cause hemorrhages when giving birth. Therefore, people agree that its use should be restricted until after birth. On the other hand, entities located in the upper middle part of the graph here are monkey species and some other common prey species that are not dangerous for children, despite the fact that they were humans in a remote past. Because of this former condition of humanity, but their inability to harm children, there was no consensus among people about whether they currently possess a soul or not. And finally, the species that are considered the most harmless and safe to consume for vulnerable members of the community, such as people, sick people or infants, are located in the upper right side of the graph. There are examples of that are like the palm tree chapaja that do not possess a soul or any other animistic feature. In some, these are, well, there seem to be different reasons why certain entities are considered to be harmful for infants. So going back to the theories I mentioned at the beginning, would they explain the emergence of food restrictions in Tayacome? Well, I believe that Viveros de Castro and Bayer's explanation cannot adequately explain the variety of taboos observed in Tayacome, because many species that are taboos are not considered to be humans and do not have a human soul, such as the fish chambira that I mentioned before, and therefore spiritual cannibalism doesn't take place. And furthermore, animals that are former humans, like many primates, are not considered food taboos. On the other hand, regarding the Heinrich and Heinrich explanation, there is no evidence so far that indicate that taboos coincide with a functionalist explanation, and that they are established to avoid some kind of physical intoxication. Furthermore, Machigenga taboos do not apply to pregnant women, but they do apply to fathers of infants, which goes against the theory that taboos are designed to protect the fetus from toxins. So is there another theory that could account for the existence of these taboos? Based on my experience living in Tayacome, I have developed a post hoc explanation for the patterns in the data that I collected. I think what is happening is that people hear that a species is dangerous from someone that they trust, and the explanation for why the species is dangerous is developed post hoc or not at all. So I noticed a similarity of this explanation between some aspects of the Machigenga taboos and Gemel's theory for the existence of baseball players' rituals and taboos. According to Gemel's theory, players believe that their abilities remain relatively constant. Therefore, they attribute the cause of an exceptionally good performance to something else exceptional that happened before the event, such as hitting the home plate 3 times with their bat or licking their bat. They then repeat these lucky activities as rituals every time. So for Gmelch, taboos are then the opposite of rituals, in that an exceptionally negative performance is also traced back and attributed to an uncommon event that took place before the performance. However, this theory does not completely explain the emergence of food restrictions as practice in a social group, because it is only focused on explaining individual behavior. So if this mechanism is at work, the question is still how taboos spread within a social group. I developed a hypothesis after observing some instances of taboos that were confusing to me, because most people didn't attribute any particular dangerous characteristic to the taboo species, such as the case of the small bird Ointi, picture here, which is a black and white kingbird, probably the eastern kingbird. While I was living in Tayacome, I was told the story of a boy in the clan where I resided, whose face became swollen after eating this bird a few years ago. So his mother told me that no one in the community could cure his illness. So she took him upriver to see the Seripigari, who is the Machigenga healer. Once there, the Seripigari asked her what the boy had eaten prior to this event. And she told him that he had eaten ointi, among other more common things. Ointi is rarely caught by the Machigenga, so they don't eat it very often. So then the Seripigari suggested that ointi had caused the child's illness and had stolen his soul. He proceeded to cure the boy by drinking ayahuasca with him and retrieving his soul from the place where the ointi had taken it, and the boy got better. So now recall the formal interview that I conducted when I asked 53 people about what species are taboos. 96% of them told me that this bird was indeed like a dangerous, and well, most of them cited the case of this boy's swollen face as an explanation. So my hypothesis is that the causal link between ointi and the illness was probably validated in people's minds through the diagnosis by the prestigious Seripigari. Word about the danger then spread through the community as parents talked and warned each other about this previously unknown threat to their children's health. And ointi became widely accepted as a taboo species. So this is the process that I propose to be behind the emergence of some behavioral taboos, not all of them. First, an unfortunate event takes place and everyone in the community hears about it. Second, an expert is consulted about this event, and he or she determines the cause by retrospectively examining what happened. For instance, the Seripigari asks about uncommonly consumed or encountered entities. Then the expert's explanation is legitimized by his or her prestige and is disseminated throughout the community, probably throughout gossip. Finally, after people know that the species is dangerous, they may start thinking about the characteristics of the animals that give them this capacity to harm or not. This may be the explanation for why most people in Tayacome know that Ointi is dangerous, but there is no consensus about why it is dangerous. The explanation for what characteristic of Ointi cause it to be dangerous are less important to the people and maybe rationalized later. Maybe they have not even rationalized yet by these people. So if this theory is true in general, then taboos should be more localized within communities because there are more social network connections, which structure how information is transmitted within communities than between communities. For instance, in my preliminary discussion with people from other Machigenga communities, many do not seem to consider Ointi a taboo. And some people have even heard about this bird. So are other taboos established in the same manner? Maybe it may be the case that this is how other species began to be considered dangerous, and people over the Seripigari came up with post hoc explanations for this being's ability to harm, given the particular spiritual or physical characteristics. One branch of my future work is directed toward answering these questions.
So Caissa talked about a theory for the emergence of a set of shared beliefs based on cultural dynamics internal to a group, these taboos. Now I'm going to talk about some external influences on cultural dynamics. So Caissa just talked about changing taboos, but more generally, what are taboos an example of? In other words, when we talk about cultural change, what is this class of things that are changing? Now, over 50 years ago, the Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth brought our attention to the fact that ethnic groups can often be distinguished on the basis of the rules by which behavior is judged. So we can think of these rules as norms, and we can broadly define norms as beliefs about what constitutes appropriate behavior in a given context. So for instance, we all have norms about what is appropriate to eat, what is the appropriate way to get married, and we have norms of child rearing, norms of commerce, and language is a set of norms for the appropriate way to communicate. So if people from two different ethnic groups have similar norms in a given context, then interaction may result in mutually beneficial coordination. But if they have different norms, interaction can lead to miscoordination. And this occurred famously in 1793, when the British under Lord Macartney, shown here on the right, who was accustomed to European norms of commerce, attempted to convince Emperor Qianlong of China, shown here in the chair, to ease trade restrictions on British goods. And the problem was that the Chinese acted on the norm that, rather than trade, these British barbarians should naturally want to bring gifts to the emperor of a more civilized society. So unsurprisingly, negotiations broke down pretty quickly. And this example is just to show you that norms have played an important role in interethnic interactions around the world and throughout human history. Now, here in the Amazonian context, we're going to look at what happens to norms when people engage in peaceful interactions across an ethnic boundary. So, for instance, over time, do the norms of one or both groups change to facilitate coordination? So, Caissa talked about the Machigenga in the community of Tayacome, inside Minaya National Park here. There are 3 other Machigenga communities that we work with inside the park. And then just outside the boundary of the park are a series of non-Machigenga communities. Now, residents of most of these communities consider themselves to be members of broader Peruvian Mestizo society. Now, Mestizos in these rural communities mostly engage in small-scale industries like logging, tourism, boat building. Most of them are colonists or children of colonists who migrated into the region from the Andes after the agrarian reform in the 1970s in Peru. Now, Machigenga can leave the park anytime they want, but with few exceptions, mestizos can't go in to visit the Machinga communities. So that means Machinga mestizo interethnic interaction occurs primarily when Machinga leave the park to buy things in mestizo stores, to work as wage laborers, or to attend boarding secondary schools. And this makes it a good place to study external influences on cultural dynamics because interethnic interaction is limited enough that we can actually keep track of it. So we're going to start by asking the questions, which types of interethnic interaction contribute most to cultural dynamics and why? So our strategy to address these questions is first to measure everyone's norms in a range of domains. And then we can ask, is norm variation associated with certain types of interethnic interaction? So after a while living with Machinga and mestizo families and participating in daily life, I developed a set of 14 vignette questions illustrating norms in different social contexts like spousal relations, healthcare, and labor. And it took a while to come up with questions that made sense in both Machinga and Spanish. And just to give you an example here, for question 9, I asked the interviewee to imagine that she has to divide an inheritance among 2 siblings. And she can either divide it evenly or she can divide it according to need. And the response, divide according to need, I arbitrarily coded as 1. And similarly for all these other questions, one answer was arbitrarily coded as 1 and the other answer coded as 0. And I used these questions to interview between 60 and 80 Machinga and mestizos here. So like Caissa, to analyze these data, I use item response theory or IRT models in a Bayesian framework. In this case, we're going to use it as a way to compare individuals on the basis of their answers to all 14 vignette questions at once. So we take advantage of the fact that an IRT model can use the covariance among people's responses to reduce the dimensions of the data from 14, one dimension for each question, down to a single dimension. So I'm going to represent that single dimension as an axis. And I interpret the poles as placing an emphasis on independence versus interdependence. So people with larger values tended to answer vignettes in a way that emphasizes social obligations or interdependence. And people with smaller values down here tended to answer the 14 questions in ways emphasizing more individual responsibility or independence. So the points here are the mean posterior probability estimates for each person. And the horizontal bars, which you can see, are the means of each group. And what this shows is that mestizos tended to answer the questions, placing an emphasis on independence, whereas Machinga tended to answer in a way that emphasizes more interdependence. Now, you'll notice that there are some Machinga down here who tended to answer the norm questions like mestizos. And the question then is, are these the ones with the most interethnic interaction experience? So to look at that, in this column labeled commerce in blue here, I've copied only those Machinga who have ever bought something in a mestizo store. And the next column labeled labor in green, I've copied only those Machinga who have worked for mestizos for at least a year. And then in this last column labeled education in red, I've copied only those Machinga who have attended a mestizo school. So what you can see is that lots of Machinga have both commerce and labor experience with mestizos, including those who have mestizo-like norms, and many others who have more Machinga typical norms up here. So there's not a strong relationship between commerce and labor experience and the norms that we measure. However, of the few Machinga who attended mestizo schools, almost all of them have mestizo-like norms. So this means that there is a strong relationship between interethnic education and the norms that we measured. So returning to our questions, which types of interethnic interaction contribute most to cultural dynamics? Well, possibly education. Now, these are cross-sectional data, which means that we're not actually measuring dynamics. So all we can say at the moment is that among Machinga, there's a strong association between being educated with mestizos and holding mestizo typical norms. But this coincides with an ethnographic impression of cultural change. So here's a quote from a mestizo woman commenting on Machinga boarding school students in her town. And she says, when the Machinga first come, they have many problems and they're used to not working. That is one of their customs. And when they come here, they have to change their way of thinking. They have to see how to get ahead. It's a struggle for them. He who does the most is the most ambitious, obtains the best things. They see that and they change. Now, if students are changing their norms, as this woman states, then why does education have such a large effect compared to wage labor and commerce experience? So based on our ethnographic experience in this population and from the literature, We've come up with 5 potential mechanisms. So the first here, differences in bargaining power. In the boarding schools, Machinga students have very limited power in their interactions with mestizo teachers, who of course the teachers have the power to punish the students if they don't behave according to the norms that the teachers think are appropriate. In contrast, in commerce and labor interactions, Machinga adults tend to have quite a bit more power because both store patrons and laborers are in demand in the mestizo towns. So in the terminology of economics, Machinga have what's called short side power in commerce and labor interactions. Now, the second here, interaction frequency bias norm adoption. This is the idea that, in the boarding schools, students are isolated from Machinga society, sometimes for years. Therefore, they interact quite often with mestizo adults using mestizo typical norms. And it could be that people come to prefer and internalize norms that they use most often. The third here, success-biased interethnic social learning. This is the idea that Machinga students come to see mestizos, in other words, their teachers, as successful and prestigious, and then they attempt to copy everything about them, including their norms. Now, the fourth one here, differences in the age of interethnic exposure. So most Machinga who engage in commerce or wage labor interactions with mestizos tend to be adults, and they've already been socialized into Machinga society. They've learned Machinga typical norms. Machinga secondary school students, on the other hand, are of an age where they're still learning norms of behavior from adults. And in this case, the adults that they learn from may be their mestizo teachers. So these first 4 explanations here are plausible, non-mutually exclusive explanations for the patterns we just observed. But I want to focus particularly on this last one here, interethnic assortment on norms, or what's called selection bias. So this is the idea that education itself may not be causing Machinga to adopt mestizo norms. Instead, maybe kids with the most mestizo-like norms to begin with are the ones who choose or who are selected to go to the school outside the community. And this self-selection could easily generate the association I just showed you. So to figure out if that's actually what's going on, in 2017 and 2019, we interviewed 98 Machinga secondary school students and 48 of their mestizo teachers at a community school here, 2 secular boarding schools, one far away, one nearby, and then 1 religious boarding school. These are all these boarding schools outside the park were in mestizo towns, and we interviewed the children in these schools using the same vignette interviews that I showed you previously. And in addition, Caissa and I lived with the students for a week, 1 week each year in each of these boarding schools. Now, also, we managed to interview 22 of these students and 6 of their teachers twice, once in 2017, once in 2019. And this allows us to actually see some cultural dynamics, to see if and how students' norms changed over 3 years. So here's that same axis again. And here again, each point is the posterior mean position of a person. And you can see that the mestizo teachers interviewed in 2017 tended to answer in a more independence-oriented norm style. This is similar to other mestizo non-teachers whom I'd interviewed previously, the data that I showed you before. In contrast, Machinga students in 2017, here on the far right, tended to answer emphasizing norms of interdependence. And this was similar to how their parents and other Machinga adults whom I'd interviewed in previous years answered those questions. Interestingly, few of these adults here had actually gone to secondary school. Now, to look at the Machinga students in more detail and to incorporate the 2019 data, I'm going to flip this axis horizontally to make it easier to look at distributions. So now independence is to the left here and interdependence is to the right. And I'm going to use the statistical model to show you some posterior estimates for hypothetical average students. So here are model estimates for the position on the axis of hypothetical Machinga in each of the 4 secondary schools who in 2017 were in first grade of secondary school. And you can see that there isn't much difference on average between the schools in terms of the norms of these first-year students. Now, if selection bias was going on, meaning that children with mestizo typical norms to begin with are the ones being sent away to the boarding schools, then you'd expect the distributions in the last 3 schools here, these are 3 boarding schools, to be shifted to the left towards mestizo typical norms relative to the community school here. And you can see there isn't much evidence for that. So now here in blue are model estimates for the positions of hypothetical Machienga 2 years later in 2019, when they were in 3rd grade. And on the right here in gray, these are contrasts, or the differences between the red and the blue distributions. So what you can see is that in the religious boarding school, there's evidence that over the course of 2 years, Machienga students tended to adopt the independence-oriented cultural norms of their mestizo teachers. See, the blue distribution shifted more towards the left. And you can see the same effect in the secular and community schools, but it's much more subdued. Now, having lived with the students for 2 weeks in each of these schools, I suspect that this pattern is due, both guys and I suspect that the pattern is due to the fact that Machienga in the religious school are much more intensively supervised and socialized to the mestizo worldview compared to the other schools. And this gives us some clues about how to design school environments to help Machienga and other disempowered minorities preserve valued cultural norms, if that's something that they want to do. So now returning to our questions here, which types of interethnic interaction contribute most to cultural dynamics? Well, intensively supervised mestizo-run boarding school education is probably a contributing factor. And the question then is why? Well, as we said before, there are several non-mutually exclusive mechanisms that could explain this pattern. But at least we've made some progress by showing that selection bias here by itself is probably not responsible for the strong association between education and mestizo typical norms. Now, on the contrary, it seems that the educational environment is causing some students to adopt new norms.
So we think it's important to show you what the Machienga themselves think of all of this that we have done with them. Each year that we go back to the communities, we present the results of the previous year's research to them in their own language during community assemblies. During these meetings, we told community members, well, we found some evidence that your children are learning mestizo norms in a school. What do you think about that? And they say, yes, of course. That's one of the points of sending them to school, to learn mestizo things. But they say, interestingly, our children don't forget Machienga norms. They know both. So in social psychology terms, the parents were saying that the students become cross-culturally competent. We thought if that's what's going on, we ought to be able to measure it, but that's a topic for another talk. So in conclusion, my work suggests that one mechanism that may play an important role in the emergence of some culturally distinctive food taboos is the post hoc attribution of causation to explain illness. This is a mechanism that, at least in the Machienga case, seems to operate internal to Machienga society and doesn't necessarily require any interethnic interaction. In the future, we think it will be worthwhile to explore the potential of this mechanism or something similar to explain the emergence of other cultural traits in other ethnographic contexts. In contrast, it seems that the dynamics of cultural norms in other domains is indeed strongly affected by interethnic interaction. One of the most powerful forms of which in Machienga society, and perhaps in many other minority indigenous societies, is highly supervised boarding school education. As we saw, there are many potential non-mutually exclusive mechanisms that may explain this effect of education on cultural dynamics, and it will take some innovative thinking to come up with ways to distinguish their effects. We also want to emphasize that the dynamics of many cultural traits throughout human history are likely to have been simultaneously influenced by both mechanisms internal to an ethnic group as well as interethnic interaction. Our goal here has been to highlight a few of these possible mechanisms and some of the tools we've developed to study. And yeah, this is what we prepare. Thank you so much.
So let's take questions both from the chat and from the room. Does anyone in the room have a question first?
Next question. I don't know if can you all see or hear me? Maybe.
Can you hear Clark?
We can hear you, Clark. Can't see
turn
you though.
Okay.
Your slides off, then I think you'll be able to see Clark.
Okay.
Should we stop sharing?
Yeah.
Sure. At least then we can see it bigger.
We stop?
Did that work?
It's a
Yeah.
very tiny person. And can you see our room now? There he is. Can you see Clark
See the
waving?
room.
I'm way in the back.
The room's really small. Yeah.
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 Cool. Well, listen. Thank you for interesting talk.
Now we can see you.
I have maybe mute that on the TV.
I don't know what's causing. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Just mute the TV. I'm coming through. Thanks. Sorry, little technical things on our end. There are many questions, but I guess one thing that I wanted to ask about the taboo study. I'm sorry I came in about 10 minutes late, and so I missed some of your explaining the methods before I saw the results. But I was wondering, in what sense so I've used the word taboos in my own research as well to talk about foods that you're not supposed to eat, or where there's some sort of norm or expectation that you wouldn't eat that food. Obviously, taboos, though, comes from a particular cultural context, which is not the Matsugenka context, nor a European context even. And then we've somehow, like the word shaman, we've used that word, extended it to different cases that are different than where it came from. So I guess it has a particular connotation to me. And I wonder if all of the foods that you're looking at, all of those cases would really be, whether taboo is the right way to think about it, right? So, and whether we know that through the methods that you're using. Because when I think about it in the American case, right, most Americans would say you shouldn't eat a dog. Is there a food taboo against eating dogs in the US? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, and then the reasons for that, I would guess, if I think about myself, don't have to do with danger per se. It's not dangerous to eat a dog necessarily. There's some other reason that maybe has to do with social relations, which is one of the hypotheses you were talking about, that dogs are like family members or something like that, right? But then also, a lot of Americans don't eat bamboo, which is another example that you gave, and I would think that if you ask people, should you eat bamboo or can you eat bamboo, there'd be many people who would say no. But it doesn't seem like there's a taboo against eating bamboo. So I guess I was just wondering, in your research, do you think, is it a unified category? Because when you look for explanations of these things, it seems like, there's also going to be diverse explanations for these different reasons why people don't eat food. And so sorry for a long question, but I was just wondering.
Are you asking, are they all moralized, or are some of these just simple functional aversions? Like,
I don't even know why you call them all taboos, right? Because the hypothesis is that somebody came up with a causal explanation that this causes harm, and then that makes it spread. So that seems like that's not moral.
Yeah.
Right. And then if we think about why we wouldn't eat a dog, it has a moral valence to it to me. Maybe not for everyone, or maybe it's discussed. I don't know. I'm just curious about the category.
Yeah.
That's whether you could find
That
more
is actually
detail by carving up the categories.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Actually, I should have been more specific in talking in mentioning what type of taboos I was talking about. Like generally, when you talk about taboos, there are either general taboos, like anybody or nobody eats in any condition. Like, for instance, what you mentioned for the American people in general. I think most of the taboos of eating dogs or cats, for instance, right? That is a general taboo. Nobody could eat it. There is a moral prohibition about it. Like you see that is Like people don't really feel compelled to eat that, right? So that is, or horses, for instance, right? That is a very common general taboo. But then what I was talking about was more specific taboos in the sense that these are the types of not only foods, but also like species that people try to avoid, that normally in other contexts, they would not avoid or they would not stop eating them. But because there is a particular danger that they see, they stop eating them in particular contexts, right? So that is what I was referring to. And you mentioned, that maybe this is a very westernized conception, but actually the Machigenga have a term for this kind of dietary restrictions. They mentioned that when you have, especially in the context of the kuvot. So when parents have small children, what they say they do is they ititagansi, or titagansi is a verb that they used to say. They do these dietary restrictions in order to avoid harm to their children. So this is a very Machigenga thing, I would say, like a conception, a thing that they practice, like I would say in all the communities that we have been, they have these different practices. The thing is that the species that they eat or they stop eating actually is what varies according to the communities. I'm still collecting more data about the other communities that we work with now, because what I presented was my research for my PhD, for my dissertation. And now what I have been hearing when we were like visiting these other communities is that actually the species that they do this itita, what they avoid eating while they have infants, the parents have infants, vary according to the different communities. So this is, I think, the interesting thing of observing these taboos. It's not that it's a common taboo, like for instance, they wouldn't eat, I think, predators because they say that they taste bad. In the same way, I think that horses that are eating in the US, for instance, right? But the idea for me would be to just check on these species that normally are eating, but in particular contexts are not, right? So that was the.
That makes sense. So there is like a local category that these are all in that category. That makes sense. Okay. Yes,
exactly, and that was the particular context in was that I wanted to focus about, because is this also for these taboos are established for avoid harming children, but also in other contexts are established to harm crops that they see that are very fragile, like for instance, corn. They also itita, or they also use this verb to avoid harming the corn. That is like a child for them in the sense that it's fragile, right? Then they have other tools in many different contexts. I actually, every time that we come back, I discover new species or new contexts where they actually have these taboos. For instance, I have mentioned also the rites of passage, right? Like for instance, when boys start hunting, they cannot eat many of the prey that they had at the beginning until they have had a certain number of, I don't know, either peccaries or birds or even fish, or for instance, tapirs, right? They have to eat a certain number of them and then they can eat them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to hunt them again, right? Also, when girls pass through this rite of when they have the menarche, they are locked and they are also forbidden to eat certain things, which is much, in this case, the taboos are more related to form a particular type of personality, and also form a particular type of body, like they think that some species can affect physically the development of the girls to become women, and also their personalities. If they eat, for instance, macaws, they say that they are going to speak too much or they are going to be loud, and women shouldn't be loud, right? So these are different types of taboos. The reasons why they are avoiding or they make girls to avoid this species is a different category. So I can actually talk a lot about taboos because they really have different categories of them. But yeah, I in the presentation I focus most on the cobalt because it's also very conspicuous. So yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. That helps clarify.
I was interested about how, in that example you gave about this particular bird, it seems like probably it was just an arbitrary assignment of this disease to eating this bird. It seems unlikely that that's true, right? Do you have a lot of other examples about the post hoc attribution of causation? And do you have any sense of how of whether these traditions are easier to form if it's a more accurate interpretation versus a less accurate interpretation of the connection between explanation?
What do you mean by accurate or less accurate?
Like I guess I mean, I guess I'm thinking more, maybe accurate's not the right word, but functional. Like if it really is going to cause harm. Like
well, for them, it really
eating this
causes
bird
harm.
really going to cause somebody's face to swell up regularly if it's consumed.
Well, that is the thing, right? Like they really think that these animals or these species in general cause harm. So it's very accurate for them in that sense, I would say. But yeah, it's like
From
other
our perspective.
From our perspective, probably would be something that is related to, I don't know, how even how some species look like, you know, like they avoid this fish maboro that is called, I don't remember the scientific name is, in Spanish it's called canero, and it's a very slippery fish, it's small, and it's kind of blind because it's kind of like this slime is covering all the body, and they think that the fish is gonna affect the bodies of their infants that are still also in formation, and they're gonna become blind, for instance. No, this is the type of associations that they do. It's like metaphorical in some cases. Also like the anteaters, so they have like their feet, the paws, are like twisted when they walk, and they think also that their children are gonna grow their feet like that, right? But then besides the ointi, I also heard stories, especially of the white colored peccary that white-lipped? White-lipped peccary. There are the two species, white collar peccary and white-lipped peccary. The white-lipped peccary is really, how do you say, skibble? It's kind of the herds of this peccary, this species of peccary, is not constantly seen around the community. And actually, in general, in many parts of the national park, of the Mano National Park, there is a biological station close by that is called Cochacashu. And even there, like the herds of the wild-lipped peccary are sometimes disappear for years, right? So the thing is that apparently they travel in very large ranges, but people explain the absence of these herds of the wild-lipped peccaries because either sick people ate them when they shouldn't have, and also girls when they are in this period of menarche and they are locked in their houses, they ate them by chance and they shouldn't have eaten, right? So once they eaten, then they disappear, they go away. So this is something that they explain afterwards it happened, right? After they heard of some of these girls that were eating these peccaries, right? So there are a few examples of this. I'm gathering more information about that, but I think this is a very possible explanation, not for all the taboos, but for many of them. That for me, I think they don't have a clear explanation of why there are taboos. You know?
Do you have any idea what makes these ideas spread? Like you said, there's a lot of behavioral variation between different villages. Are there any things that are different about the ones that are more common to multiple villages versus the ones that aren't? I mean, I guess you don't have the temporal your studies just been a few years about this, right? So you wouldn't necessarily know how long each belief is going to last, but.
Yeah, exactly. And I haven't done this yet in all the communities, which is something that I'm still doing. And I'm in the process of actually analyzing the data too. But yeah, what I was mentioning before is the fact that the Seripigari, the Machigenga healer, apparently, for what I was asking, people really trust in his opinion about this, the spiritual danger that some animals have, or some species in general have. So this is the authority, no? The taboo is going to be spread out because this person has said this, and everybody believes that. But then, for instance, this happened in Tayacome, that is a community that is kind of, there are other communities that are closer to the border of the park. One of them is called Maizal, and that is also closer to the biological station, Cochacashu. And in that community, the authority of the Seripigari is not very well known, for instance, because he passed away some years ago. But when I did this research, he used to live in the communities up in the headwaters of the river. So it was very far from this smaller community, Maizal. They barely know him. They barely knew him there. And he once passed there to visit. They knew that he was a healer. And then I remember one of the inhabitants or the member of Maizal told me once, like, yeah, Cesar came here and then he taught us about these taboo species that we really didn't know about. So it's like it was the first time that they heard about it, right? So there are some other species that are taboo, but I think there are for different reasons. I have to ask better yet because I haven't worked in this community yet about this particular topic. But they knew about the authority of the Seripigari, but it's not something that they have very present. And I don't think probably is going to be an effect on why they don't eat certain species or not. Like now they know about some species because he told them some of this information, but not necessarily like it's something that is widespread now. Right? So yeah.
So as far as you can tell, it's more the frequency of contact with people who have that information that determines the spread across the community rather than.
It is that, but it's also the fact that they believe or not in him or not, right? That is also what I think is something that is triggering this. But yeah.
More questions? Oh, is there one in the chat? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wait, how do we do? We go turn them on over there. Dan, go ahead. Dan.
I think, yeah, I got it. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I apologize, my camera is offline right now. So I think your account of, as I understood it, includes two important components: prestige bias transmission and explanation of rare events, right? And I think both of those are compelling components. As you probably know, in the history of the development of approaches to cultural evolution, there have been sort of two schools that sometimes have collided and sometimes there's been a rapprochement. And that's, the Boyd and Richardson school, which, has emphasized population level processes and to the extent that it gets down into the interpersonal dynamics, tends to focus on what we can think of as content-free mental mechanisms like prestige bias and transmission, right? And then there's the Sperberrian school that has focused more on the content-full component, that is how features of the mind, whether those are due to biological evolution of the mind or the existing cultural contents of a given mind, fit or don't fit with any new idea. That is what Dan Sperber calls an attractor, right? And certainly, rarity you can think of in part as potentially being an attractor. But I think here it might be useful for you to take a look at some work that a number of years ago, Carlos David Navarrete and I did on food taboos. And we documented, and I'd be interested to see whether the same holds true in your Machigenga data. I would quite strongly expect it to be the case that that animal products, in particular meat, are vastly overrepresented in food taboos compared to plant products. So the two plants that you listed, of course, it's a sample of two there, right? So one would want to look at your entire corpus of materials. And the explanation that we provide for this is that animals, including humans that have a broad diet, so animals like rats or human beings, right? They have to have a particularly sensitive toxin detection mechanism because they live in many different ecosystems, they sample many different foods. And that food in the course of both rodent evolution and human evolution is a mixed blessing in that it is enormously nutritious, meat, in that it's enormously nutritious, but it's also a source of pathogens because when the animal dies, its immune system dies. And the same is not true of plants that defend themselves chemically. And so rats, humans, we both preferentially target meat and animal products in the development of conditioned food aversions. So one trial learning the so-called Garcia effect, where individuals are intoxicated by something they've eaten and henceforth in humans for about 10 years thereafter, they find it aversive, even if they previously found it pleasant. And the conditioned food aversion system, which is clearly a biologically evolved psychological mechanism, it has two criteria, okay? And one is novelty. So if you haven't eaten this before and you eat it, and it makes you sick, then you avoid it, right? And the other is basically proteinaceous content, and in particular, animal products, okay? And so, if you just have random events in the world where someone gets, eats something and gets sick, regardless of the kind of sickness, there's more likely to be an association in the minds of at least some of the individuals with an animal product than with a plant product. And the idea resonates with learners because they have the same mechanism in their minds. So if I tell you, don't eat broccoli, then it'll make the gods angry, or you'll go blind, or whatever it is, that just doesn't seem very intuitive. But if I say, don't eat the right hindquarters of the red kangaroo, that seems more intuitive by virtue of the presence in all human minds of this ambivalence towards meat, if you will, right, in animal products. And so when you combine that with prestige bias, right, so either the healer gets sick, or the healer thinks about what might be plausible to the healer, and the learners have the same bias in their heads, you're going to get a differential representation of different foodstuffs in this way. And then the additional component is what in other work, also with Carlos David Navarrete and other folks like Ann Pizer and Theo Seymour, we call negatively biased credulity, which is that the learning system, much like there's a prestige bias, right? The learning system has a greater credulity bias towards information about danger than it does towards information about benefit, because there's an asymmetry in the costs of the false positive versus the false negative, right? If you fail to believe true information about danger, the cost to you are higher than if you erroneously believe false information about danger. And there's no equivalent asymmetry in most benefit domains, right? And that, I think those ideas lend themselves to what you're talking about. There's a rare event, it involves a hazard, it involves, an animal product, okay? And so this is a kind of a super releaser, right? There are multiple attractors in the minds of the prestigious individual and in the minds of the learner. And so the idea is plausible and it spreads, right? And so while across communities, you might get differences in the details, is this bird tabooed or not, right? The overall pattern will be the same. And just lastly, in regard to Clark's earlier comment about, is this a taboo or not? So, how we want to define taboo as a technical term is, a subject for debate. But even if you look in the Polynesian context where the term originated, there's sort of ambiguity as to whether it's moralized or not, right? That is, bad things happen when you break these rules. There's supernatural mediation of the bad things happening. And sometimes those rules are clearly things that we would call moral. And sometimes they're not, but there's always supernatural mediation, right? And supernatural mediation, of course, is, as in Melch's work on baseball magic, is just, filling in the details as to, well, we don't understand, right? We can't see why these things fit together, so we come up with a story, right? Forgive me, that obviously was not a question, it was more of a monologue, but I'm excited about your work and that you're, venturing down this path, which I think anthropologists for too long have moved away from. It was, of course, a central topic in anthropology, and I hope that this is helpful for you.
Thank you very much for your comment. It's really useful. I think I have copied also some of the references that you have suggested. One of the things that I actually would say probably would add to the part of the fact that animals are more likely to be taboo because they tend to decompose more often. There are also there are studies in the past that have focused on trying to explain taboos based on the categories that people do about animals or in general the living world, right? So I remember, there are, I think from the 80s, actually, people within sociocultural anthropology also doing this kind of classification of animals and relating that to the same classification of people within a group, a society did of themselves, and what can certain sector of the society eat in relation to the category of the animals, or in general, animals and plants and living beings that they can eat, whether these correspond or not. I think this is very interesting, but I think, for instance, in the case of the Machigenga, I would say even that these classifications of, or these categorizations of items, or even just saying that animals are more likely to be eaten or not, I think not all of the taboos, but at least part of these taboos are actually explained by just fortuitous events, in the sense that, for instance, there are taboos against, for what I just mentioned, right? Eating wild, white-lipped peccary, but there is no taboo against white-colored peccary, right? And they are like the same, basically the same. They look the same. Of course, the behavior is different. The wild-lipped peccary runs away, as I said. They disappear for years, sometimes the herds, then they come back. The wild-colored peccary are always available. There is no taboo against them. And at any time, I think girls during the menarche also can eat them, right? Also species of fish that are super similar, like the boquichico, I don't remember the name there is a scale fish that is very common. It can be eaten all the time. Another fish that is, I think, even from the same family, I'm not an expert of fish, but I think they look the same. They are taboo. So this is the type of I'm trying to get why these differences exist, So yeah, I agree with the theory about why animals are more often taboo than plants. But then there are these different things that are kind of very common that I couldn't explain just with categorization of species.
Well,
so that's why I also
so I think this is fascinating, but I think it's important to be clear in both your own mind and how you think about it, and also in the way that you report this, to distinguish between emic and edic, right? So that the account that I gave you just now is an edic account about why meat is more likely to be tabooed and how those taboos arise and spread. The core of the argument is that taboos are noise, right? That they're not functional at all. It's just random events that lead them to any given food product in any given community to become tabooed, right? Now, as you said, people come up with post hoc explanations, right? They try and make sense of the world, but those post hoc explanations have to fit with their existing, cultural schemas about the natural and human worlds. And so they can become quite elaborate and quite parochial to particular cultures. But those explanations are most likely post hoc. Now, it certainly can be the case, and I think Dan Sperber would say that if there are two animals that equally are available and thus possible to be tabooed, all else being equal, the one that somehow fits into a schema in the local culture that makes it more sensible, so it's got a soul or whatever, that taboo is going to have greater durability and transmissibility than another one, right? So, but again, that's an edict explanation. It's not saying people think this because it is part of their cosmology. Rather, it's saying that the idea is more likely to persist because it's congruent with their cosmology. And those are
also,
different.
But also the cosmology changes after it is explained, right? So that is like why some species are attributed with a soul without being a soul, having a soul before, right? So it's something that I think is both ways, not necessarily.
Yeah,
one
absolutely.
before.
Sure. And John mentioned Barth's work. You know, I mean, there's a long tradition in British social anthropology of, you know, the sort of Machiavellian approach to culture where you know, people manipulate all kinds of rules within their culture, including food taboos, right? And marriage practices and all, you know, exogamy, all kinds of things, kinship, they manipulate them for their own individual benefit, right? And so I think that's probably a factor also, right? So, you know, if people rethink their cosmology about a food product when the cost benefit ratios for them as individuals start to change. Right?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in on I don't know, I haven't asked Caissa this question, but I mean, one of you mentioned Dan about the fact that animal products tend to be more likely to be tabooed than plant products. In the Machianga case, my impression, I don't know if you agree, is that the diversity of animals that are included in the diet is much greater than the diversity of forest plants that are included in the diet. So, I mean, just randomly, if you're going to attribute, you know, causation to something, it's more likely that you're going to pick an animal to become a taboo than a plant, because the Machianga eats surprisingly few forest plants compared to animals. At least that's my impression. So it might, we would have to, I think we would have to take that into account when we start to evaluate, at least in the Machianga case, the fact that you know, that animals show up more often as taboos than plants do. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about, especially going back to Dan Sperber's argument about cultural attractors, there's a whole class of, or a whole subset of taboos that you showed, where it's the physical characteristics of the animals that sort of lead them to become taboos, like the big teeth on that chambira fish, for instance, and some other ones like turtles, big land turtles, because they're heavy, right? And the Machianga say, well, the soul of the turtle will squash the soul of the infant. So, I mean, there may be some, like, you know, these are also, you know, edict from our perspective, because we can observe these characteristics of the animals. And maybe the Machianga don't think of them that way. But maybe these are also taboos that are more durable too, because it looks like they're physical characteristics that can physically harm you of these animals that also lead them to become, you know, taboos in some cases, not in all cases. But there was this one cluster of points there that was all animals that were taboos because of physical characteristics. And there was, you know, I don't think there was much of a consensus on whether they had souls or not, but they were all considered taboos. So yeah, so, you know, interesting things to look at in the future.
Yeah, I'll just say that very briefly, because Susan said there are other questions. And Neverett and I didn't look at the base rate, which is your point about the Machianga diet. And that's an excellent point. My impression is that's probably not driving it, because you see similar patterns in agriculturalists, for example, where plant products are, you know, the staple and so on. But certainly that would be a more definitive test.
Yep. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe the volume needs to go down, but I'm not sure.
Doesn't seem to be.
Okay, good. I know we're kind of short on time, but I was hoping to ask a question about the second part of the talk. One thing that came out that was interesting to me is that you're finding that the effect of education on changing norms was much stronger than the effect of participation in the market. And I was wondering if you thought, because, you know, as you know, market integration is kind of the explanation of the day, or has been for a long time, and the thing that a lot of people measure in cross-cultural studies. And I was wondering, do you feel like this finding kind of speaks against the idea of, I mean, would you interpret as being that market integration has a low effect here on changing norms? And what thoughts can you give us about like what kinds of things to measure when we're looking at norm spread across cultural boundaries?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, like you said, it seems like, at least in the norm work that we've done, that education has this strong effect, stronger than commerce, for instance. And but I also have to say that children who finish these boarding schools, they graduate, they are a lot more adept at engaging in commerce than much younger who have not gone to school. Because they know math, right, and they speak Spanish really well. So it's almost like education it's in some cases facilitating these other domains of interethnic interaction, like wage labor. They're also much more likely to leave the communities and engage in wage labor if they've had some education with mestizos than if they haven't, for various reasons, one of which being language. And because they've spent years in a boarding school, they see what you can do with money, right? So it's all, I would say that this idea of market integration, I think education and labor go along with commerce. I think they're all sort of part of the same deal. And like you said, it's true that a lot of people, when they measure market integration or proxies of market integration, they're looking at how much of your income is in money or something like that versus bartered goods or things like that. And so it would be interesting to know whether, for instance, education, interethnic education, in this case, is correlated with things like with greater commerce activity. So yeah, so what I would just say that at least in this case, we were able to separate them out at least a little bit, the education, the labor, and the commerce. But in the grand scheme of things, the folks who have finished these boarding schools are engaging in more wage labor and commerce than people who are not. Does that get at your question?
Yeah. I mean, the only other thing that's great. Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I was, just because now, I mean, many people here in your talk and in the spaces that we're in are doing this cross-cultural research. And I guess I was wondering, do you have thoughts based on your work and your experience, like how should we change like the kinds of correlates that we're measuring? I mean, obviously adding education is going to be important, and a lot of people do that already, but there's just a worry that sometimes we measure these, you use the word proxy, right? And then market integration correlates with so many other things. And then there's this worry, I have the worry that we think it's explanatory. And so I wonder, like, how can we do better? Of things we could measure?
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time defining market integration also. So I think, I mean, the best I could say is that maybe, I think a lot of it is very much context dependent, depending on the ethnographic context. Like there may be parts of the world where education is not that important, or everybody has education. It's like baseline education, people know how to work with money or whatever. And so that's not a good proxy for market integration. And then there are other things that cause people to, have more of their income in purchased goods versus self-produced goods, things like that. So I think, paying attention to the ethnographic context is going to be important. And I'm not sure necessarily, I mean, there may be universal measures of some, proxy of market integration, but I think if we want to do cross-cultural comparisons, it'll be important to lean really heavily on the local ethnographic knowledge of the communities that you're working with, and be able to justify and maybe define in a local context what you mean by market integration, and whether that is actually comparable to what somebody else in another ethnographic context considers to be, high levels of market integration. And then what you measure as a proxy will very much depend on your local definition of what that means, and what actually you're trying to measure. Yeah.
Thank you. Super, super helpful.
We're out of time. Were you raising your hand? Oh, okay. I think we're out of time then. Thank you so much for staying up late there in Leipzig to talk to us. We really appreciate it. And I hope you'll feel free to join us in other Beck Talks. I guess we're mainly having Leipzigers coming up soon, but so maybe not so exciting to you as it is to us since you see them all the time. But yeah, do keep an eye on our speaker series because we have a lot of other fun talks on topics I think you'd enjoy. So
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks very much. We really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thanks.